Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. In each episode, we engage with diplomats, lawyers, and peace builders who have played key roles in efforts to resolve conflicts around the world through legal frameworks and dialogue. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Today, I am very honored to welcome my good friend, Berhanemeskel Nega, a distinguished peace builder with over 35 years of experience in multilateral diplomacy, mediation, peacekeeping, and peace building. Berhanemeskel has held key roles with the United Nations, including the UNAMID Director of Political Affairs and the former head of the UNAMID offices in South Darfur and Khartoum. Prior to his time in Sudan, he served in various United Nations missions, including as deputy and acting head of mission for the UN Integrated Peacebuilding Office in Sierra Leone. In our conversation today, we are going to dive into Berhanemeskel's time leading the United Nations African Union hybrid operation in Darfur, and in shorthand, known as UNAMID. Now, UNAMID was a joint peacekeeping mission between the United Nations and the African Union established to support the implementation of the Darfur Peace Agreement. UNAMID was a groundbreaking mission that sought to bring stability and protection to a region long devastated by conflict, while conflict continued and attempts to negotiate peace were ongoing. As one of the largest peacekeeping operations of its time, UNAMID faced immense challenges, working to protect civilians, facilitate humanitarian assistance, and build local peace amid complex security and political dynamics, and against a backdrop of many failed attempts at negotiating a durable solution to the conflict. Berhanemeskel, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, for the very kind introduction and also for the opportunity to have a conversation with you on an important issue, peace in Darfur and the role of the UN and the peace operation, which you mentioned, UNAMID.
Let's dive right into this conversation. Let's start with having you provide a little bit of context about the time that UNAMID came into existence. Now, since early 2003, the world has been witnessing years of devastating violence in Darfur, which neither the Abuja Peace Agreement in 2006 nor the predecessor African Union mission in Sudan had managed to quell. Can you walk us through the situation in Darfur at the time in which UNAMID was created?
Thank you again, Paul. Yes, as you know, Darfur is located on the western part of Sudan. It's quite really a large mass of territory, the same size of Spain. And throughout history, Darfur maintained independent, existence until 1916, when the Anglo-Egyptian forces seized it and was incorporated into Sudan as we know it today. At that time, of course, under the Egyptian rule. Basically, Darfur also comprises of more than 80 tribes, of which the three are the main ones, like the Fur, Zagwa, and the Masalit. These are more of considered as African tribes. And there are many, including, some which consider themselves as Arab tribes. So throughout history, and when Darfur existed as an independent, sultanate, Darfur, by the way, means the land of the Fur. The Fur is one of the largest ethnic groups or tribes in Darfur. So, there were tensions, there were conflicts, basically intercommunal conflicts between the farmers, which are mostly the Africans, which I mentioned as, the three main and most others, and the nomads, which are called the herders, which move around the territory with their cattle looking for water and grazing. So those conflicts existed as part of really the fabric, the social fabric of the community. But lately, in the 30s, started, changing their nature, of course, after Sudan's independence and shaping, the whole Sudan's political, structure here and there. And with the proliferation of small arms, and the politics involved in that as well. So the nature of the conflicts evolved into, political, competition for resources, religious dimensions, all that. So now, just going a bit moving forward, it's a long history and story, especially when Sudan was confronting various conflicts within the country, including the South Sudan issue, when we had the agreement and before all the negotiations. The Darfur groups now felt they were also marginalized. They need change. They want to be recognized and their rights respected. So it was around 2003. There were two groups, armed groups established: the SLA, the Sudan Liberation Army, led by Abdul Wahid, and JEM, the Justice and Equality Movement. So now those groups, armed groups, started, of course, challenging the government and engaged in armed conflict, attacking the government, also forces here and there, and causing casualties, in some cases significant ones. So the government now had to, was alarmed and tried to mobilize itself and, of course, responding, but in a very harsh way. And that caused significant casualties and destruction and burning of villages and the entire towns here and there. And especially recruiting also the militia known as Janjaweed, which were more of on the Arab tribes side, now involved in the conflict, escalating, the situation. And by some estimates, up to 400,000 civilians, mostly non-Arabs, were killed in the initial stages of the conflict, which drew the attention of the international community. And that was really how the whole conflict started. I mean, just in summary, of course, at that time, as the AU was set up as transition from the Organization of African Unity into AU with different objectives, charters, interests in peace and security and human rights. In fact, human rights, crimes against humanity, and genocide. I think that became also one of the areas where the AU had its attention on. Of course, the UN also was interested in this because of the press coverage and the whole attention given to the atrocities committed by the Janjaweed militia, of course, in collusion with the government of Sudan, the Bashir government. In addition, in Washington also showed really a very unusual interest in Darfur's situation. Very, very interesting turn of events in Washington, playing really a leading role in that sense, opposing what is being done by the Bashir regime. So those were really the overall context, the background for the crisis, how it came about, how the international community also showed interest in this, leading to the deployment of the AU mission, the small armies, what they call it, African mission in Sudan. And also it was not that effective, I think, the initial response. And also discussions through the AU and in Addis and in various capitals, including Jamina in 2004, where ceasefire, kind of cessation of hostilities agreement was somehow reached. Those were the overall really background and the whole situation before UNAMID was established finally in 2007 in July.
Well, let's pick up on that. As you mentioned in the African Union mission, was created in 2004. Tell us a little bit about the challenges that it faced and why it was deemed insufficient, which then led to the creation in 2009 of UNAMID. And can you tell us a little bit about the process from going from an African Union mission to a hybrid United Nations African Union mission? A little bit of the inside story on that.
Yes. Again, the AU was just established, transitioned from the OAU with a new mandate and really a bit of focus on peace and security and human rights here and there. Then at the time, the AU was left with no option, but I think to do something about it, given the whole attention of the international community and also the seriousness of the crimes committed in Darfur. So that sense as well, I think the Bashir government is very much against any UN or international intervention. So what they saw a bit of, giving them a space somehow, which they can work with to some extent, was having kind of an AU mission there. So they were open to that AU mission idea. And they allowed the AU to deploy a mission to Darfur, which was authorized by the AU Peace and Security Council with an initial mandate of 7,700 plus troops, military personnel, and police strengths. That was quickly authorized. But there was difficulties again to get that mission to its required level. And even the government of Sudan, the Bashir regime, started creating all sorts of hurdles, couldn't even move around that mission, and was subjected to attacks from all quarters anyway. So basically, it might have provided some kind of support in terms of protection of civilians in certain localities, but overall was not able to achieve the mandate, the huge mandate, which was given to it by the AU, endorsed by the Security Council, by the way. It has a Security Council mandate. So it was that slight that more serious discussions took place about having some kind of effective peacekeeping presence on the ground. And in addition, during this period also, as mentioned earlier, there were negotiations in Abuja to reach some kind of agreement on managing the situation. And in May 2006, the Abuja agreement was signed between the SCLA, led by Mini Minawi, your good friend, and of course the government in Sudan. Abdul Wahid was the founder of SCLA and really the key leader of that group, did not want to participate in those discussions and did not sign, but Mini Minawi was very much interested. He signed. He came to Washington, D.C., as you know, and had an audience with President Bush at the White House. And that agreement was really very much facilitated, if not spearheaded, by the U.S., in the person of Deputy Secretary of State, Robert Zoellick. And so it was very much, the U.S. which really helped to reach that agreement. Unfortunately, as always, as you see in Darfur, not everyone is on board, especially, just have only minimum now in that. So the context really, which led again, and then the need for a mission, a more effective mission to be set up, and the discussions which led to the establishment of UNAMID in 2007 under Security Council Resolution 1769 of 31st July. That is, how it happens. Of course, why hybrid and all that nature? As you know, the Charter of the United Nations, Chapter 8, recognizes the role of regional organizations in the maintenance of peace and security, of course, in collaboration with the UN Security Council, which has the primary responsibility for such activities. So that was, I think, if you see it, it's a new approach, novel approach, has never been done before in that settings, but the Sudanese government wouldn't have allowed a UN presence. So they saw that model probably with the AU being there can, probably satisfy their own interests and concerns. So they agreed to the hybrid arrangement. I think there is a lot to be said about the hybrid arrangement and the UN AU cooperation in many, many cases.
That's very helpful in terms of understanding how we went from no peacekeeping force to an AU peacekeeping force to a hybrid. And in a few moments, we'll get into some of the questions about this hybrid nature. But first, let's talk a little bit about your personal experience. Can you share with us how you came to be the Director of Political Affairs and the head of the UNAMID offices?
I joined UNAMID in 2014, around end of 2014. Before that, I was in Sierra Leone for about 12, 13 years, and then when we closed the mission in Sierra Leone, I was supposed to go somewhere else. That was the intention of the Secretary General, but that did not work out. Me going to a higher level of position somewhere else, which was more of a political appointment in a way, but apparently that did not work out because of certain political considerations by certain member states as well, which they have to consent when you are at a certain level. So then I ended up in Darfur, which I never thought I would be there, but I found it really interesting, and I think a lot of experience from Darfur, including working with you in Juba and on many, many issues, which is far more complex than we had in Sierra Leone. And I think we will talk about also later on about Sierra Leone, how it relates when it comes to peace operations. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, and different circumstances, and your outcome also depends on that. Let's talk a little bit now about the mandate of UNAMID. At the time in 2007, Darfur was in the midst of conflict, humanitarian crises, political crises. There was the Abuja agreement, but only, as you say, Minnie Manawi had signed on to it. The mandate was initially only for 12 months. What was UNAMID charged with doing, and what resources did it have at its disposal to carry out its mandate? Yes, I think that's very, very, really important question now. Again, UNAMID came under a very, very difficult political and security and humanitarian context. In the first place, the government of Sudan did not want any kind of international presence in that area. It was engaged on the South Sudan issue, and I think that they wanted to move on. But there were other actors which forced the regime to accept some form of presence, international presence, by way of a hybrid, mission with a very controlled mandate and all that. So even if you see the initial mandate of UNAMID, it was very much limited, very, very much limited to the implementation. The first thing I think always has been the protection of civilians. That is what really the whole tension, was drawn to. That was one, protection of its own personnel, protection of the UN property surrender, but also, monitoring the implementation of the Abuja Agreement, certain aspects, the demobilization of the Janjaweed groups and the disarmament, and also, some kind of restricted movement of the National Defense Forces of Sudan. It was part of the agreement. The agreement is quite big, 80 pages. I don't think even, the key parties read it and understood it. That came up later on, what is this and that. So it was that context really first to have some kind of presence on the ground and see how it would evolve, as the mission progressed, in the next, as you would see, subsequent extension of its mandates. There was a, drastic mandate here and there. But the first, I think, probably 2, 3, 4 years, I would say, the mission was confined to its bases, practically. It was not allowed to go anywhere. It was not allowed even to bring its personnel, including military. So there was under severe, really, restrictions by the government every step of the way. So not much to be done. I think likely what happened was, even from the time of my own presence, I think when I arrived, things were somehow taking shape and also, things changing somehow. The only thing which added value added, what we can say, is the protection of civilians in certain localities, in certain areas, because the IDPs and those who were, targets of attacks, started coming around and, locating themselves around the military bases, the bases of the mission. So, you had no other option but also, to play some deterrent role, from attacks mostly by the Arab militia, the Janjaweed and other groups. So I think that gave some kind of at least psychological safety to the civilian population to a larger extent. But eventually, I think we'll see the gradual change of the mandate.
Let's pick up on two things you mentioned. First, the evolution of the mandate, and then I have an additional question on the invocation of sovereignty by Sudan to actually try to contain the actions and the implementation of the mandate. But first, let's talk about this mandate. It was the evolution of the African Union into the hybrid mission, and then it was initially a small force limited to its bases. It eventually became the largest peacekeeping force in the globe. With quite an extensive mandate. Can you walk us through that evolution of its mandate and what it came to include as its responsibilities?
Yes, but initially when the mission was set up in 2007 under Resolution 1769, the authorized strength of the mission was quite significant. If you see 19,000 plus, 19,555. I don't know how those numbers came about, 555, military personnel. And then you have the civilian police and, just civilian police. And we had also what were known as formed police units. Formed means armed police units. Around, I think, 17 units, each 140 personnel, very, very effective from countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, all those which were working even in my office around that. And also, of course, around 3,000 civilian personnel, both international and national staff. So it was quite, as you said, the largest mission at the time the UN ever had. So that was, in terms of strength and the budget. So, initially it was about $1.5 billion a year. It's quite, again, the most expensive sort of UN peace operation ever at that time. So that was the plan. But again, to reach that ceiling of overall, 23,000 plus, was not an easy thing for the mission. All the way, there were obstacles and the visas issues and all faced by the mission. And also, again, since we are talking about the evolving mandate of the mission, and the initial basis for the mission was, of course, the Abuja Agreement of 2006. But I think the political discussions, the political efforts had continued through the UN and AU especially, which, of course, led to the Doha peace agreement, as you know, which was signed in July 2011. So that was, I think, a bit of a turning point for the mission as well in terms of its mandate, more of streamlining what it should do. Basically, I think with the core mandates now identified, of course, the first one was and remained as a protection of civilians and facilitation of humanitarian delivery of humanitarian assistance and working with the humanitarian actors. And the second was, supporting the mediation efforts, the political efforts, which we were doing in Juba and before in Doha. And there we have also another layer of actors, key probably. Our role was more of facilitate and supportive role, but the key actors were the AU high-level panel led by former South African President Thabo Mbeki, which was really leading the whole effort on the mediation and the political process. After the Doha agreement was signed, of course, it was a very extensive agreement. It has many provisions, implementation of all those provisions, including DDR and demining, you name it. This is just internal dialogue, consultations. This is just, they have all the elements. And so it was dumped, including, justice issues, rule of law, human rights. So those were aspects of the mission's mandate within the core mandate. And the third one, which always puzzled me, was, Paul, helping to solve intercommunal conflicts, which we mentioned earlier in the beginning. These were part of the social fabric of the societies in most countries, where you have, communal, tribal conflicts over, resources, water, here and there. And UNAMID found itself to deal with that issue, as the root causes of the conflict somehow. But, now if I see it from where I sit now, probably, that would not have been, it's a wise thing to do, instead of focusing on the critical issues of peace, and especially the protection of civilians. So those were the mandates. Critical mandates, and it's a huge mission, Paul. It has all sorts of components: military, police, civilian, but within those civilian components, if you see, you had a political component, we had a civil affairs, which deals with the intercommunal conflicts, which we mentioned, the human rights, the rule of law, the dealing with children issues, dealing with women issues, dealing with DDR, you name it. It's a lot of components. Sometimes, you have difficulty even to get them together and really focus on certain issues. So anyway, it was quite complex and dynamic, kind of mission. Again, the mandate, as we said, evolved over time. And working, by the way, also this is very, very from my own experience, working in the UN. You have too many actors. You have 18 agencies, UN agencies also sometimes doing the same thing you want to do. And most of the time, not really kind of coordinating in a sense. So we had also, in addition to UNAMID, 17, 18 UN agencies, lots of non-governmental organizations, humanitarian actors. So that's, how you coordinate, especially when your critical mandate is protection of civilians, facilitating the humanitarian delivery of humanitarian aid.
Tapping back into something earlier you had mentioned, that in addition to those challenges, coordinating among the 17 or 18 agencies, this expansive mandate, you also had President Bashir, the authoritarian leader of Sudan. It seemed at every turn trying to limit the ability of UNAMID to carry out its mandate, and doing so by invoking the fundamental international principle of sovereignty. Can you walk us through that added dimension of the challenge for UNAMID?
Yeah, Paul, in fact, that was the main challenge. UNAMID, the lack of political will on the part of the government. Also, it has agreed with the UN and the AU to accept a mission, signed Status of Forces Agreement, and which is called SOFA, and Status of Mission Agreement. All those are very clear, spelling out the obligations of both parties, including the government of Sudan. But again, as you said, for Bashir's government, every step of the way, you cannot even move from place to place, whoever you may be. The strictest, restrictions on the movement of the UN personnel, not only the military, but also civilian within Sudan, and even to get a new personnel was very difficult. No training, no key equipments which the mission needed. So it was very, very, really extremely adverse political environment for UNAMID to operate within Darfur and Sudan overall. And that really impacted on the effectiveness of the mandate of the mission. If you have 20 plus thousand troops but confined to their bases doing nothing, then there is no point in spending 1.5 billion a year. So I think when we talk about sovereignty and consent, and even I was reading the report by the Secretary General on lessons learned from the operations. One of the recommendations they made was strong consent and of the host country. I think that's where the problem lies, frankly. International interventions of this kind under the UN Charter, to which member states are a party and obliged to comply, not respected and enforced, then what is the international system, frankly, here? So I think that the limits when states accept those obligations, and there should be some consequences for their actions later on to undermine those obligations. So I think they could have, in the first instance, said, no, we don't need any mission. We won't sign it so far, or whatever. That would have been a different question. Once you agreed, accepted, and it's your obligation also, then what are the consequences? Here, I think you will see another aspect, Paul, probably, which I didn't mention. When UNAMID was established, it was not only the Sudanese government which was reluctant on this, but also within the Security Council, there was no consensus. Of course, they let it go once the AU was involved, and the Sudanese government said, okay. But the Chinese in particular were completely behind the Sudanese government. So there was no consensus. There was no agreement within the Security Council on most issues pertaining to Darfur and international action. That was also another factor. And the AU again, I think we'll come to this probably later on. Again, it was not that helpful in being very strict when it comes to Sudan's compliance with its obligations at the time.
Let's pick up on that point, the role of the African Union. And it's two-dimensional. First of all, this was a hybrid African Union UN mission, peacekeeping, and it was the first of its kind. Tell us a little bit about how that worked out militarily, politically, funding-wise, and then also talk about the role of the African Union in supporting UNAMID and in supporting UNAMID's ability to carry out its mandate.
Yeah, and of course, this is also a very important consideration. Again, Chapter 8 we mentioned earlier of the UN Charter provides for cooperation between the UN and regional organizations in the maintenance of international peace and security. And it's in that framework the whole arrangement came about. And the OAU and the United Nations had earlier started, those kind of discussions for a long time in the 90s during Boutros Ghali's time as Secretary General. I was very much involved in this as well, as a coordinator of the African group in the Special Committee on Peace Operations. We call it C34 in the UN as a diplomat, in the 90s. One of the things which we really focused was on enhancing African peacekeeping capacity, preparedness and capacity for peacekeeping. So that evolved over time. And when the AU was established, of course, the AU focus now on peace and security, human rights, I think created a kind of conducive, environment for those kind of joint operations as well, in a way. So that was the understanding. It was in that framework, that two organizations would work together and so on and so forth. But the way they set it up, also the resolution is very clear. 1969, the mission was of African nature and so on and so forth. And also, administratively, it was based on the UN rules and regulations here and there. So mostly, although it's nominally hybrid, the AU has a role, And most of the troops, later on, you will have a lot of non-African troops. We had from Thailand, we had from Nepal, we had from Pakistan, we had from Bangladesh, whoever wants to was participating. But mostly the administrative, the budget was covered by the UN from assessed contribution, and the staff were recruited except the senior leadership of the mission. So it was run by the UN, frankly. The AU was kind of a spectator in a way, and to some extent making sure the Bashir government is not oppressed somehow, giving them a bit of comfort somehow. So that was really, there was a great contradiction between that whole concept of, two organizations working on clear principles, guidelines, and towards a common goal. But mostly, I think it's in name. Whatever mechanisms there were a couple of mechanisms in terms of coordination. They had one, what they call it, tripartite mechanism that was the Bashir government, Sudan, the UN, and the AU meeting once a year and discussing what are the problems, those are the visa issues, or restrictions, and peripheral issues. And also they have some joint assessment missions every year, and once a year visit by the AU ambassadors based in Addis to Darfur to see things, but nothing comes out of it. So I think, frankly speaking, the AU's role was kind of marginal in a way. Most of the decisions were made at the UN level. And when we say even at the UN level, at the headquarters level, not even by the missions. You don't see them in the lessons learned reports now issued by the UN, all those kind of things mostly give a rosy picture of what transpired.
Pivoting a little bit to a very specific on-the-ground question. Every peacekeeping force has a mandate, as we've discussed. There's a status of forces agreement, as you've mentioned, and there are rules of engagement relating to the use of force. When, for what reason, and how much force can a peacekeeping force utilize? You'd mentioned that oftentimes the peacekeepers were confined to their bases, such to the point that the internally displaced came and set up their IDP camps adjacent to the peacekeeping force. But walk us through those initial rules of engagement and whether they were fully utilized in order to bring peace to Darfur.
Yeah, I think this might probably take on that. It will be very short on this. Yes, it's required any peacekeeping mission to have a rule of engagement. And UNAMID had one, but I have never seen it. So anyway, yeah, you will be surprised. So again, I think that's where the problem comes. To what extent even member states who are contributing troops to missions allow that mission to do certain things, taking risks. The mission is set up under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, which means it can take action. It can take military action in self-defense and to implement its core mandate if there are certain obstacles hindering the mission. So I don't remember any instance, as I say it again. I think the whole thing which we saw from the beginning to the end in Sudan, in Darfur, was obstruction, restriction by the government, by Bashir's regime of the mission from doing its mandate. But there was an occasion which I remember, at least when I was there, when the mission attempted to force itself into certain kind of action to do its job. Even I have my own experience once where I was in charge in the place. There was the largest IDP camp called Kalma. Hundreds of thousands of IDPs were there. Once we had a serious confrontation with the military, with the Sudanese military, because the IDPs never allow the military not just entering their camp, but also even to pass through the road, passing their camp. So there was confrontation when Bashir was visiting, and a number of IDPs were killed. And when tried to really push the peacekeepers to take some action there to protect the IDPs, it was not an easy issue in the first place because the military structure itself, the force commander or whatever, the contingent commander, they have their own chain of commands. The civilians may not order them to do these kind of things based on the assessment. So they have to do things they see it fit. So yeah, the rules of engagement, I think that is a lack of clarity. I didn't see it in the lessons learned report of the Secretary General. There was no mention about it, but that is critical. That is really very important. I know in places like Sierra Leone where the role of engagement was very clear and it worked, and the mission acted on a number of occasions and successfully with the backing of the government, of course, but not in Darfur.
Let's pivot to another legal framework that was applicable in the crisis in Darfur. We talked about the UNAMID being created by the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council also in 2005 referred the situation of Darfur to the International Criminal Court. And the International Criminal Court was very active investigating the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, and the genocide that was being committed in Darfur. But there was also another case where the International Criminal Court issued 3 indictments. And this related to the 2007 assault by the Justice and Equality Movement on a UN peacekeeping base, which, if I recall correctly, led to the deaths of a dozen or so UN peacekeepers. Abu Garda was indicted by the International Criminal Court. That indictment was eventually quashed and dismissed. But also, there were 2 others under the Banda case that were indicted, and one of them has passed away and one of them is still at large. Walk us through a little bit about what happened there and what the role of the International Criminal Court is in indicting parties, non-state armed actors, others for attacks on peacekeepers. This is a first of its kind development in the world of international criminal justice.
Yeah, I think this is very, very interesting as well, even for the Security Council to refer a situation to the ICC for the first time in that sense. I think in 2005, under Resolution 1593, it was a groundbreaking decision. Interestingly, of course, as soon as this action was taken by the Security Council, you recall all what was happening around the world, the statement by the Arab League, by the Organization of Islamic Conference, even by the EU itself, calling for the suspension of this decision, to indict, to refer the matter to the ICC. Interesting. That resolution was also passed by 11 votes in favor, 4 abstentions, like countries like Algeria, Brazil, China, and the US abstained. And I was fascinated by the explanation of what of the US ambassador at that time, saying we support there should be accountability for this kind of crimes, but a hybrid type of court would have done the job. It doesn't mean that this ICC has jurisdiction over states, non-parties to the Rome Statute. It's normal, understood, but I think they were 100% behind the decision, clearly, political and diplomatic. But again, I think in terms of attacks against, peacekeepers, this has become also a very increasingly concerning situation. As Darfur, of course, I think more than 60 peacekeepers were killed and a lot more than that injured and taken hostages. This has been a very recurrent problem. At a point, we were used to it. So we had very stringent security arrangements on troop movements, staff movements. Whenever you go to do some small thing, you have to be, surrounded by tanks and APCs, all that. So that is what happened. Of course, the indictments you mentioned and the cases, the 2 cases, one was against Amis, the case which was dismissed, and the second one still, nothing. It's very difficult, frankly. Sometimes you don't know who is the attacker. It can be a government-related force, it can be a militia, it can be any tribal group or criminals. So, as you know, there is Convention, 1994, UN Convention on the protection of, on the safety and security of UN personnel and related personnel. That was adopted back in 1994 by the Sixth Committee. I was part of that as well, and I was in that meeting. But when I was sitting there, I never thought of the peacekeepers. But now sitting from the other side, I think there was a clear gap in defining, those kind of crimes when it relates to peacekeeping missions as they evolved now in the current circumstances, because peacekeeping has evolved as well from unarmed observers or just monitors here and there to active somehow forces which can use force in self-defense or in implementation of the mandate. So I think there is a lot of discussion now, as you know, including in the Sixth Committee and in various circles, on how to fill that gap and see how peacekeepers could be effectively protected under international humanitarian law. The Rome Statute also deals with, makes it a crime, to attack peacekeepers. But again, you define peacekeepers in what sense? Engaged in military confrontation or peaceful or whatever thing. So I think there is a lot of work, but it was a critical problem for us. If you had come to any camp, UN camp, to UNAMID camp in Darfur, I think we spend more money on protecting ourselves than protecting probably the IDPs. It is fortified in 3-4 rounds of all the big, walls and moving around in APCs and tanks. How can you do your work under such circumstances? It's quite challenging as well, I think.
If our listeners are wondering why it is that you know so much about the International Criminal Court, it's because you're one of the signatories of the Rome Statute. You were there for the negotiations and you signed on behalf of your government. So that's a fun fact for our listeners.
I signed the final act, yeah, of course. The statute, the government didn't want to sign it. So the final act, all of us who participated in Rome were given an opportunity to put a signature on that, yes.
Fantastic. Let's pivot now to 2020 and the phasing out of UNAMID. There was the political transition in Sudan to a hybrid civilian military government. In Sudan, there was the signing of the Juba peace agreement, and the decision was made to phase out UNAMID. Was that a good idea? Was it a bad idea? Was it premature? What were the consequences of phasing out UNAMID in 2020?
Yes. The decision to draw down UNAMID and finally exit from Darfur was made quite a bit earlier. The discussions started in about 2014, and then 2016 was a resolution adopted. 2017 again, the UN came up with a whole of system kind of approach, peace building, and even compartmentalizing the whole Darfur by certain areas. So this was an active discussion which was ongoing for some time to draw down the mission. And I think a bit misguided understanding of the progress made in terms of stabilizing the place, but mostly motivated, if you see, the underlying reason was the government's continued obstruction and really push for the mission's drawdown. So practically not doing much in a sense. So New York was convinced, the mission has to go. The AU, of course, happily agreeing. And Washington, the changing government here at that time, which was less enthusiastic about, the US involvement in peace missions or UN and then here and there. So all those combination of factors, I think, were pushing, accelerating really the whole process of drawdown and exit. But frankly, after 2018, December Revolution in Sudan, the situation could have been reversed. I think if we had, in seriousness, considered at the UN and UNAMID and AU, we could have used that new opportunity of a new government, a new thinking, a new openness. And with a little bit of pressure, we could have come up with a reasonable presence, taking into account the interest of the people there. The IDPs were vehemently opposed The civil society groups were opposed. They were writing letters to the UN Security Council, to the AU Peace and Security Council, but no one was listening to them anymore. That goal set by Bashir was the overriding goal, even after he has gone. So I think that was a missed opportunity. We could have calibrated the whole situation and continue to engage, especially after Juba, after all that, what has been achieved for the first time in the history of Sudan political process. You know it better than I do, Paul, to have those many armed groups, 16 of them, in one place, negotiate for more than a year, come up with a serious agreement, substantive agreement. Who was missing from that? Only Abdul Wahid, who had everyone else around. In 2006, it was only Mini Minawi sitting there and signing. In Doha, it was just one, LGM, Liberation and Justice Movement, of so many groups. But in Juba, we had 16 of them, practically every one of them except one. But again, I think we dropped the ball, and we are paying a price for that. That was a huge mistake again. And I didn't see it in the report here, in the lessons learned report of the UN on UNAMID.
Just as the time that decades of political negotiations and peace negotiations had come to fruition, and as you say, you had 16, all but one of the non-state armed actors from all over Sudan came together, negotiated with a hybrid civilian military government, and reached a genuinely comprehensive deal. I think the peace agreement's 200 pages long. Just at the time that you crystallize the political dimension, the peace dimension, the peacekeepers leave and essentially, I think, undermine the long-term prospects for a durable peace. Berhanemeskel, let's take that question a little bit and explore it a little bit in terms of the big picture of the role of peacekeeping in building a durable peace. Whenever I speak with young professionals, mid-career professionals, of course you need peacekeepers, but they're not all the same. They don't all provide the same role. They don't all have the same mandate. And compare a little bit your experience from Sierra Leone and the peacekeeping in Sierra Leone with your experience in Darfur, and what are some of the genuine roles that an effective peacekeeping force can actually fulfill?
Yes, this is an excellent question. When we talk about UNAMID in Darfur, people may think of, okay, so why are we wasting $16 billion? And if that is what we get at the end. But I think peace operations have also proved to be very effective in many parts of the world if they are managed properly, if they come under the right environment, and so on and so forth. So again, you mentioned Sierra Leone. There are others like Liberia, East Timor, Angola, countries, stable countries, which we see now, which went through the UN peace operation, support. For example, if you see Sierra Leone, when we say peace operations, it's not just a military operation. Of course, at a certain level, you may need a military to do certain things, sometimes take primary responsibility. For example, in Sierra Leone, the UNAMID, the mission at a certain point, I think for a few years, had a primary responsible for maintenance of security in the country, because the army and the police were not really functioning properly until we had a successful, SSR in the country and the security forces rebuilt. That function was really carried out by the mission, but over time, transferred to the national security forces. Once you do that, there are other phases. Again, peace operations have really evolved, transformed over the last how many years. You have special political missions which work on political transition, elections, and so on and so forth, justice reform, in many ways. institution building, the constitutional reform, like we did in Sierra Leone. So, for example, we had 3 stages in Sierra Leone. The first was, in fact, 4. The first was the military observers, which called UNAMID observer mission. And then after that, when the mission was expanded, again, 17,000 troops we had. That at that time, that was the largest mission before Darfur or Sierra Leone for that small country. We had 17,500 military personnel there. Well, and then we came to a special political mission, which was tasked to really oversee the post-conflict reforms, the decentralization, the election, the SSR, all those aspects, which had a 4 years lifespan. And then when we finished that, moved to the peace building phase. All the stages we had gone through in Sierra Leone, including the transitional justice. We had a hybrid special court. We had a TRC process. Everything worked systematically. And I think that was one of the best successes of the UN, of the international community engagement. And we still have Sierra Leone, as a peaceful and democratic country. We had 4 elections, successive elections since the end of the conflict in 1992. And twice we had a change of government from one political party to the other peacefully. So that is how peacekeeping can be effective, and you can get really a good return on your investment in people. When we closed the mission, I stayed there for 13 years, Paul, from the beginning to the end. And I think that's one of the lessons, to have a kind of a continuity in the, certain leadership roles, and building on the successes of the various phases of the mission. And when we closed the mission in March 2014, Mr. Ban Ki-moon came. Initially, we were told he cannot make it because of the crisis, Yemen, or at the time Ukraine, and this was very busy. And finally, we're told he's coming. He's coming because he has to show some success where the UN can show, which very smart of him. And it was a success. And then one morning we had a meeting with the UN country team, everything sitting there in a hotel room, conference room. And we were sitting there, and he turned towards me and asked, Mr. Nega, you have been here for 13 years. Give me 4 reasons why we succeeded in Sierra Leone. I want to know, give me 4 reasons. Okay, that was kind of unexpected, 4. The first thing I think came to my mind was, of course, the people of Sierra Leone and their political leaders wanted peace. They genuinely wanted peace, and they wanted to cooperate with us, and they allowed us to do our job. That was the first thing why we succeeded. So the political environment is always important, which we never had in UNAMID in Sudan. The second thing is, of course, the international community, especially the Security Council, worked in unison. I've never seen any disagreement between any among the council members, and including the P5. They were unanimous. Even when we approached them, we used to have a monthly coordination meetings with the ambassadors, the P5. They come every month. They work with us. The UN was the lead. They follow us, even the big powers. So that was one factor. The third factor was, of course, the UN itself. There are so many agencies, their boundaries. This is my place. This is, don't come. UNDP, I can do the SSR or the DDR. Why should the mission get involved? UNICEF tells you, no. What is the mission doing about children? It's my area. Don't come in. That never happened in Sierra Leone. One UN family. The head of the mission was the head of the whole entire UN, both the political and the development humanitarian agencies. That was the first country in the world where the one UN concept was applied, although they abandoned it now because the fighting in New York between the big departments, prevailed. In the field, it was working. It was really, providing what the people wanted, but not in New York. So that was one of the things we worked as one. And the fourth, of course, the mission. The mission was a very special mission. We had 3-4 different layers coming one after the other. We had a good succession plan. This is a very well managed mission. So those 4 factors which came to mind immediately, I think those work now when I see them anywhere else. I mean, if there is any lessons, serious lessons learned to be done, not like the UNAMID lessons learned.
That's a tough spot when the UN Secretary General turns to you on the spur of the moment and says, give me 4 reasons. It sounds like you had 4 really good reasons for why peacekeeping and the peace mission was such a success in Sierra Leone.
Like everyone knows, even now when I think of, UNAMID and NC and elsewhere, I think those are critical, very critical requirements for any success, which we're lucky enough to have in Sierra Leone.
Well, in thinking about requirements, I just have 2 more questions for you because you've been so generous with your time. And the penultimate question is, at the moment there's a conflict raging in Sudan. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Secretary General called for some type of peacekeeping force, Takadum. The representatives of the civilian population have endorsed that call. Now, at the same time, Russia vetoed a Security Council resolution calling for a ceasefire. It may be a little too early for us to be speculating about what a peacekeeping force might look like in Sudan, but you've been there before. You've been the political director of a peacekeeping force. What do you envision a peacekeeping force for Sudan at this current moment in time might look like, and what could it do?
Yes, I think this is a difficult, frankly, question now. Of all the questions you asked me, this one is the most difficult one. I think, it's always difficult once you missed an opportunity to do it again, in even in more difficult circumstances. Now we have a situation where you have no functioning government in Sudan. In Khartoum, the Khartoum we knew is no more the Khartoum now. Even Darfur has significantly changed in terms of really the whole setup and the security situation. So what kind of intervention would work now is difficult. For me, I cannot tell what can be done. But I think the most important thing which comes to mind is, how you approach the 2 parties now, the 2 main parties, what kind of pressure you apply on them, frankly, to create that conducive environment for any international presence. I think that is where really the real challenge comes. Again, as Sudan, as you know, always the problem of Sudan is not just an internal problem. Its external dimension is more even difficult to deal with. So what kind of pressure can be put on the 2 parties, the main ones, including their external backers, so that they can come to, a sensible arrangement for international or regional or whatever, practical arrangements can be made to help the people. But the situation, as you know, is unfortunate, getting worse, and the civilians are suffering more than anything else. But you cannot avoid addressing it. But how to address it is the issue. I think we have to go beyond the traditional things which were tried so far and find, some kind of bold, kind of approach to it. Again, frankly, the 2 parties and their external backers. And the people, as always, want peace. They are open. I think they are calling, of course, you mentioned some of the groups, asking for, they were against the drawdown of UNAMID, even those people in the beginning. They knew this was coming. So that's where we are, I think.
Well, Berhanemeskel, let's end with a question about key takeaways from your lived experience. Many of our listeners are young professionals and mid-career professionals who are working or anticipate working in the field of peace negotiations, peace building, international law, peacekeeping. what are the one or two things that you want them to take away from this conversation, that you want them to remember as they embark upon careers and paths of peace building?
Yeah, I think one is overall on the concept, frankly, on the need for uh, international support, in situations of this sort, which we have failure clearly on the part of the national governments to protect their population, the vulnerable population. I think that is not something which we can give away. I think what we should do is to learn from past successes, not just the failures, and come up with more workable approach, and that can be done. Frankly, that can be done. At the end of the day, if we live in a rule-based world, then there are rewards and consequences for our actions. Whoever we may be, you can be head of state, you can be an ADP or armed movement, whatever. So I think those are a matter of principled, actions and approaches here and there, which we learned from UNAMID. It was just, first probably motivated by international uproar here and there, and appeasing here and there, all that aspects, bringing things which cannot work together, trying to create that artificial sort of arrangement and then try to solve a complex problem. So I think when you deal with a complex problem, you have to get to its roots and, from the outset, try to project, how you can do it. Once you set that kind of mindset and, roadmap, then I think it will be easy to achieve your goal. I think that's what I see, more of seriousness. I think I have my own reservations, my feelings about the UN and the AU. UN has been trying to reform itself here and there, everything is just again cosmetic, internal sort of repositioning, not a drastic approach, to respond to current realities, but, just to shifting things won't work. I think UN needs a critical overhaul and complete, probably, to focus on what the charter wants it to do. The charter is quite sensible still up to now. If you read it, it's a very, nicely written document. It's a matter of what, over years the UN digressed, whatever, trying to be everywhere at the same time, but being nowhere where it was supposed to be. So those kind of things have to be taken care of, I think. And the AU is, I am so disappointed by the AU. I had high hopes. I was one of those championing the AU in the UN in the 90s, when really all these critical issues of peace and security, the role of how to enhance it, the UN, of the role of the AU, especially as I mentioned in the C34 Special Committee on Peacekeeping, as a coordinator of the African group. But now the AU is not up to the task completely. It is full of bureaucratic, people around there appeasing each other, and not dealing with the real issues. So it's a major disappointment. So I think we need serious overhaul, reforms everywhere, and change the whole system. I think that's how I see things now, sitting from where I'm sitting now here.
There have been some amazing successes in building durable peace around the globe, as you mentioned, with peacekeeping operations playing a key role. And there have been some pretty dramatic failures, in particular Sudan and what we're seeing currently in Sudan and other places around the globe. And it's important to have that big picture perspective to think through how these institutions that are responsible for building durable peace might actually themselves need to be reformed, revitalized, re-energized. I wanted to thank you for taking your valuable time, for walking us through the complex history of UNAMID, for helping to share with our listeners your insights as to, the role that peacekeeping plays in building a durable peace and how it can be done better, what lessons we've learned from you, from some of UNAMID's successes and some of UNAMID's failures for future peacekeeping missions. And I just wanted to say it's been an honor and a privilege to have this conversation with you and to know you for so many years. We spent quite a bit of time in Juba together during the Juba peace negotiations and got to know one another really well. And then as a senior peace fellow with PILPG, we've had the opportunity to collaborate on a number of peace building matters around the globe. And I treasure our friendship, and I treasure the contributions that you've made in the past 35 years and that you're continuing to make now with PILPG. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Likewise, thank you for this opportunity, and I enjoyed this conversation as always with you, and appreciate the role PILPG has played, is playing, and will play. I think there are many other situations which we never mentioned, we didn't mention today, including in Africa, which we have to work on diligently. And I think we need peace, we need stability, we need human rights and prosperity for especially the ordinary people around the world in Africa. Thank you for this. Thank you very much.